What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? The 24 hours before my dad died from stage 4 lung cancer, he was in the ER and then the ICU, and we were unable to be with him because of the hospital COVID rules. My mother, sister, and myself had been texting and calling him all day and got no responses. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of the ICU nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed away very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he was gone. Later that morning, while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital and going through the bag of belongings the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there, and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone, and all of our texts had been read. Not mine or my mom's and sister's. I thought this was weird, but I figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed the chat app I vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially worked like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad had been chatting with this girl hourly for the last 24 hours and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on, why he was in the ER, and so on. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having at the very least an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later I tracked that girl down and spoke to her via DMs, and found out she was 19 years old. She was 17 when they met. He was her high school bus driver, and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he died, and was dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy. But it sure is a shitty secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad, with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I had never found out. I don't know how disturbing this is. Turned out it was pretty fantastic for one, but not for another. I was adopted and told a silly magical story about my birth parents that most certainly did not seem true even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together. But their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her marrying a non-white. Plus, she was very committed Christian and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings, and we are all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. I never got to meet my mother. She died a year before I searched. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone, and I'm fine with that. I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-biological family was also adopted. She was older than me. She tracked down her mom later in life too. She was in a hospital and had been this since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled. Physically, mentally, cognitively, learningly, sensory, and was sexually assaulted by an orderly, and she discovered that she was the result. Endings to our searching are not always happy. An uncle beat a guy almost to death with his bare hands. He had walked in on a friend molesting a kid. He had to pay a fine and do community service for a long time, but also didn't have to pay for beer at the local bar for a few months. He was so reserved and kind that it threw me when I found out what he'd accomplished in his younger years. The reason Grandma moved away, when my dad was still a baby, to a big city, more than 3 days away from her family, was because she stabbed her stepfather and almost offed him in a very small village. Later, she told me that he was a R-wordist. She didn't elaborate on that, and I didn't ask any follow-up questions. She ended the conversation with, "I did the right thing." We never met the other side of the family, for the best, to be honest. She was my best friend of 7 years. We had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer to her. After about a year, we had no real ties to the state we had tried out, so we said, screw it, let's go back. She's basically family. We were all so happy to be reunited. She was almost over every night for dinner. We all laughed and talked and had a blast. It was the best year of my life. Then slowly she started trying to turn my husband and I against each other. Anytime we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan B for us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues, and how she wanted to have a kid just like him, and just needed a sperm donor. This all happened at around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his seed and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was terrifying and panic-inducing, so much so that we ended up having to move out and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I had never had a friend like her, only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. Husband and I are great now, by the way. If you're enjoying the story so far, remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment with your stories below. Now let's keep going. I found out that my aunt, who was 13 at the time, was sexually assaulted by her uncle, my great-uncle, and had a baby in a cellar in the basement of her home. The baby didn't make it, and so she and her little sister buried it there. Years later, when the aunt, who had repressed those memories, had a baby, she remembered it all. When her family found out, she was labeled the SLUT of the family. My dad's side is garbage. My grandmother was married for over 50 years and never saw my grandfather's dong. Was trying to think of a word for that, and I'm like, okay. That my mom cheated on my dad for 20 years and still hasn't told him to this day. I'm still trying to figure out what to do and how to go about this situation, and exposing the truth about her to my dad, but I'm afraid he would die of a broken heart. Worst thing is, she cheated with my godfather, who used to come to the house and drink coffee with my mom and dad every day. A work colleague appeared on the front page of a national newspaper for a life of fraudulent qualifications. He claimed medical and law degrees, was a brigadier in the army, and was the CEO for a major health fund. He actually was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, but that and the health fund role were largely built on the fraudulent qualifications, and a progression of the jobs also based on these claims. In reality, The only qualification he actually had was as a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew. The fraudulent degrees had been gained when he was in the Army Reserves recruiting, and he had access to submitted position applications. He came undone when he applied for a government job, and some flags were raised by the recruitment people. He tried to withdraw the application, but didn't realize that an application for a government role has the same weight as a statutory declaration and cannot be withdrawn. It all went south very quickly, and he ended up doing jail time. A former friend of mine from childhood was a youth pastor at a summer church camp. Turns out he was grooming young girls and teens, both at camp and online after camp was over. The only reason I found out was back in 2011. He was in his late 20s at the time. One of the girls told her parents and the cops posed as her online, while he had fun to a webcam. The cops then convinced him to drive 3 hours to go meet up and hook up. When he showed up at the girl's place in the middle of the night, the cops were waiting and arrested him. He's now a convicted naughty offender and did time in jail. The crazy part, once he got out, he moved to Texas and married a divorcee that had kids. He's also now the Dean of Online Studies at his church and is responsible for the growing number of students taking classes online. Oh no, how could this be a terrible thing? I can't imagine. Oh God. Anyway, on to the next story. I was pretty close with my youngest uncle growing up, at least in pictures. He was in his mid-20s when I was like 5. One day, when I was in middle school, he just stopped coming around completely. My entire family told us kids that he was backpacking around the nation. In high school, I was going to genealogy project on my grandfather, and accidentally found my uncle's name on the naughty offender registry. Come to find out, he was running a CP ring, and had served 16 years in federal prison. He's out now, and my family pretends nothing happened. I stay far away from that mess. My uncle was arrested for a cold case sexual assault/murder from 1972. He always seemed like a nice guy. He shot himself in the head right before sentencing. When I was 17, I dated someone who told me when he was drunk that not only would he probably hit me one day and just wanted me to be prepared, but he also used to sexually assault his little brother. Every now and then I remember that moment, and it just floored me how dangerous that kid was. That went from horrible to, fucking terrible real quick. I found a scrapbook of my mom and a guy I didn't recognize from her immediately post-college. Turns out he was a long-term boyfriend of hers, who offed himself when she broke up with him. My grandfather found his body, I learned at age 20, by finding the book enshrined to him. When my grandfather passed away, we discovered that he did not exist. His name was not in any government registry. He was a normal citizen, paid taxes, had a license and everything. He lived a long life, married to my grandmother for over 50 years, had multiple children, everything was normal. Still, now nobody knows who he really was and why he had a false name. My mom received birthday cards with money in them for years from her parents. She kept the cards with the money in them, saving to buy a piano for sentimental reasons. My sister, who has repeatedly stolen from family members, found the collection of cards and money and took them. My mom only wanted the cards back when she realized what happened, and my sister denied everything. Fuck you, Emily. While my cousin was walking around with her son in the woods, she came across a hunting stand. She climbed it and found a pair of binoculars. Sitting straight forward and lifting the binoculars to her eyes, she saw her own bedroom window. Let's be logical here. If it was a legit hunting stand, it was facing and closer than 500 feet to a residence, which is illegal, which means it had to come down with prejudice. If it was a peeping Tom, well, it had to come down with prejudice. When my brother and I visited not long after, she showed us where it was. We tore it down and literally wrapped it around a couple of trees. We bent the fricker to complete uselessness. I get an angry call the next day. Did you tear down the hunting stand yesterday? Fuck yeah, I did. That was your uncle's! Turns out my cousin reported it to the family and they ignored this issue. When the uncle was asked, he said there was just an old treehouse out there. Even when he was exposed, they didn't really care. They were more upset about the damage we did. Suffice to say, I have written off most of that side of the family. There was a kid that bullied me in grade 5 and 6. Turns out his father was molesting him and his brother throughout their childhood. I found out the reason one of my uncles didn't want to go back to Korea when he retired was that he actually couldn't. He was fearful for political reprisals if he tried to return. Turns out his brother was part of the group that assassinated the South Korean president back in 1979, and his own innocence was never proven, so was in fear of getting arrested if he ever tried to go back. I met a super nice guy at a networking event when I just started out in tech. He had a ton of connections and was just a nice family man, super rich. Eventually we became friends and he was acting as a mentor figure to me in the industry. Went over to his massive new house, met his family, and so on. He had the demeanor and looked like an Al Borland from House Improvement, to give you an idea. Like 4 years later, I was looking at the naughty offender registry map in my local area while I was shopping for houses. Lo and behold, his house popped up. In the early 2000s, he was convicted of co-running a commercial CP sales site. He served 5 years for it in federal prison. Only 5 years for distribution? That's actually kind of fucked up. No, really fucked up. Oh my god. One of my favorite teachers in high school turned out to be a child lover who had been assaulting the same boy for 5 years. After my husband died in 2020, I found out he had been having an affair with a 30-year-old. He was 55. She apparently aborted his baby. Everything was told to me about his prior life was a lie, a second marriage for both of us, and he had been having naughties with men since he was in his early 20s. To sum it up, I didn't know this man at all. We had been together for 10 years and married for 6. My great-grandmother was married to 3 different people at the same time. The men were from different branches of the military. She was collecting all 3 of their paychecks at a time. When I was young, I had vague ideas about my uncle being dodgy, to say the least. In that at family events such as weddings, my parents would tell me and some of my cousins to stay away from him. When I was in year 8, we were doing a lesson in citizenship class when we had to cut out pieces from a newspaper. And I came across an article saying that he'd been recommitted to Broadmoor Prison. I went home and Googled him and found out he'd been in prison for the 80s for kidnapping and sexually assaulting someone, and had been in and out of prison for other offenses. He also tried to sue the Sun once for defamation, since they printed something incorrect about him. He was awarded 1p by the court because it technically was defamation, but it was agreed that what they had printed couldn't have damaged his reputation any further. All I know is that he was in a halfway house for a long time. However, from what I've gathered, he was released about 5 years ago. I wasn't close to this person, but I did hang out with them a few times. The best man at my wedding had another really close friend who turned out to be a serial killer. It messed him up pretty badly. He already had mental health issues, and this sent him over the edge. I can't even talk to him anymore. I miss you, man. And that's the end of today's video. I hope you all enjoyed the stories I had for you. Remember to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment with your stories or thoughts on the stories down below. Now, if you want more stories, I do have a playlist for Reddit stories and creepy stories, if you like that sort of thing. Check them out. I need the watch time. I'll see you next time.